like to welcome you all this evening. My name is Gary Heap. I'm the city engineer with the City of Gilroy Public Works Department. I'm also the project manager for this downtown parking management plan development. We have a number of folks here on the panel this evening, and they'll introduce themselves as they come on board as part of the presentation. But I'll go ahead and do the quick introduction, and then I'll hand it over to the consultant, and they can go ahead and start that presentation up. So let me say that enhancement of downtown is a priority for the City Council, and especially the downtown parking. Successful management of parking in the downtown is critical to the success of that downtown area. Residents, shoppers, and employees all rely on parking in the city's downtown area. Currently, street-side parking availability in front of businesses is scarce, while parking in some city downtown satellite lots remain infrequently used or relatively open for parking. The new downtown parking lot located at the northeast corner of Eagleberry and 7th Street will be completed in the next few weeks, and a plan is needed to identify how best to utilize that parking lot as well as the other parking lots within the city. Management of our downtown parking requires the development of this parking management plan, and we're happy to have W-Trans on board to help us with that effort. With that, I'd like to introduce Brian Canepa, who will kick off the presentation here from the consultant. Or is it Abe?
So
Abe.
we'll actually start with me. Yes, I get to start.
All right, Abe. Sorry about
oh, no worries. You'll see Brian in just a moment or a few moments. I'm Abe. I'm with RM Design Group, and just want to go through a couple or a handful of the procedures and features if you're not familiar, or just to rehash some of them. First of all, in terms of the procedures for today's meeting, the meeting is being recorded and will be available on the project website. But the only parts of the meeting that will be online are the presentation and the question and answer period. So during the discussion part of the workshop, please feel free to share your ideas openly, knowing it is not being recorded for public viewing. Please remain muted throughout to eliminate any background noise. You'll actually, to unmute yourself, we ask that you raise your virtual hand, which I'll indicate on the next slide, and then we'll allow you to unmute yourself. So next slide. So along the bottom of your screen, there we go. You have a toolbar. On the left side, you have the unmute and mute. You have turn video on and off. And then there's a Q&A button. And some of these toolbar buttons, if you're on a mobile device, are going to be in a expanding menu on the bottom right side of your screen. We ask that you send Q&A questions, just general project questions, at any time during the presentation or the Q&A period. You can use the Q&A feature there. If you don't see the Q&A feature, you can just send a chat message to the host, which is me, and I'll record the question. And then after the presentation, when we open it up a little bit more, we ask that you raise your hand to speak, and again, we'll allow you to unmute yourself. So that's it for me, some of the logistics, and I will turn it over to Debbie Rudd.
Hi, I'm Debbie Rudd. Want to make sure I'm unmuted, right? I'm Debbie Rudd. I thought I'd start off by introducing the team. You've met Gary from the city. We also have Rochelle Bedell here, who is the communication and engagement manager with the city. From W-Trans, we have Brian Canepa and Will Andrews. And W-Trans is a multimodal traffic engineering and transportation planning firm. Brian is the parking practice leader at W-Trans. He's also a transportation planner, and Will is a transportation engineer. We also have with us from Strategic Economics, Dina Belzer, our economic consultant for the team. And from RRM, we have myself, Debbie, Abe, and we have Aiden, who's helping us run the slideshow. So what is this workshop about? We're here tonight to share with you what the Downtown Gilroy Parking Management Plan is all about. To learn about the current parking usage and management in the downtown area and how it relates to your downtown economy. We're also going to hear from Brian some common strategies used in downtowns for parking, and share give you an opportunity to share your ideas about challenges and opportunities for enhancing parking in the downtown. So the agenda is simple. We're going to give a short presentation. We're going to have an interactive poll throughout the presentation, and we're going to end with questions and answers and a facilitated discussion. So if you have any questions and you use your Q&A button to post something, we will keep a tally of that. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll answer all of those questions that were posted, and then we'll open it up for just a general facilitation. So we'll start with an icebreaker poll, and you should see on your screen a question pop up. So this is kind of to help us practice what we're going to be seeing. So the first question is, what connects you to downtown Gilroy? And you can select all that apply. The options are downtown residents, Gilroy non-downtown resident, a downtown business or property owner, a Gilroy non-downtown business or property owner, a downtown employee, or an employee outside of downtown. So if you could click on those, and we'll just keep a running tally and give everyone a few minutes to do this. Okay, so it looks like we have oh, nice. So we have a good selection of representation from around the community, with more in the downtown resident category, or the not downtown resident category, and in the downtown business category. That's good. Great. So if you still have on your screen the poll, you can click the X in the right-hand corner to eliminate that. So what are the objectives for this downtown management plan? First, evaluating the current parking conditions, really understanding those, including the parking supply and demand for public spaces and for private parking spaces. Assessing the current operational practices, like how much free parking, how long can you park there, there's shared parking in the current city programs, and then identify potential improvements to those. Estimate the future parking demand by looking at projected future development, and then develop strategies for meeting current and future parking demand. And finally, identifying funding and revenue opportunities. So right now we're in the first phase of the community engagement process. And after we get through this phase, we're going to finish the parking demand analysis and develop some parking strategies to bring back to the community and city council to present ideas and findings, and then wrap up the final parking management plan in the summer of 2023. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to walk you through the existing conditions findings.
All right. Thank you, Debbie. I'll check my microphone. Can everyone hear me okay? Debbie, give a thumbs up. Cool. Great. All right. Thank you all again for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I will be talking again, Brian Cannon from W-Trans. And I will be talking about parking and the work that we've been doing so far, and looking forward to getting your input here. If I could get my screen to move. There we go. So here's our study area that we're looking at. The map is kind of turned sideways from what you normally see it on a north-south basis, but you have essentially 1st Street on the left and extending all the way over to 10th Street on the right, to the railroad tracks or Railroad Street roughly on one side. And actually on the other side, it actually stretches down to the Civic Center area. So it's not a perfect rectangle. We want to include different areas. Those are also the different colors that you see here are zones. So for purposes of analysis, we broke into zones, understanding that someone who's parking down on 9th Street is not going to walk all the way to 2nd Street to go to a business. So what did we do here? So we conducted a full survey of the downtown, and this included first inventorying all of the parking spaces in the downtown and counting the occupancy of those spaces from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on these particular days. And we wanted to do that particularly so we could see parking demand patterns on a typical weekday, on a typical weekend. And we were shooting for a special event day. And we did count that day, but as many of you know, it was pretty rainy weather. So I'll talk to that later, but we did count that day. Ultimately, we surveyed over 3,000 spaces, 3,230 to be exact. Blend, as Debbie said, of on-street spaces, public off-street spaces, and private off-street spaces to get a really comprehensive look at how parking works in the downtown, because all these things interact with each other. And this is what it looks like. This is a picture of parking utilization on the weekday. So the parking demand peaked between, when we looked at every hour that we counted, from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. on a Thursday. The map here shows colors. These are on-street parking occupancies for everywhere that we counted. The colors denote the level of occupancy, with red being the most full and green being the least. And so you can see, for example, that in what we call the core downtown between 4th and 7th on Monterey, you see a little bit more red, orange, and yellow. Other parts of downtown maybe a little bit more green. Looking at the downtown as a whole, at peak hour, there was almost 1,400 spaces occupied, about 43% of the supply. So less than half the spaces total were occupied. But that's certainly not uniform across the downtown or by space type. On-street spaces and public off-street spaces tend to be better utilized than private off-street spaces, which, again, taken as a whole, there are a lot of private off-street spaces, were about a third full. And as I mentioned here, the core downtown was really the area that experienced the highest levels of demand, which for those of you who come to downtown probably know this well. But this picture here shows these lots here in red and orange are the public off-street lots between 4th and 6th. And those were heavily utilized during Thursday and also on Saturday, whereas other lots that are further out in the core downtown were less so. But again, kind of similar trends here. You have much more usage of the on-street and public off-street lots, less of private off-street. Looking at the weekend, on Saturday, I should say in particular, peak demand shifted a little bit to about 1 to 2 p.m. Again, the occupancy didn't change significantly overall, nor did the demand patterns. So you still had most of it in the core downtown, or at least the hot parts of it, and still a much stronger preference for on-street and public off-street parking than private. And lastly, I said we did count we wanted to capture an event day, and we were trying to do one earlier in the season for the Tamale Festival, but that didn't happen. I think that was canceled. So we ended up having to count during the holiday parade. And unfortunately, as it denotes here, it was raining, apparently pretty hard too. So we did do the counts. The counts did show that about 42% of available spaces were occupied. Monterey was closed from 3rd to 7th Street along some of the side streets. So we did account for that in our counts. And, you know, yes, there was a fair number of cars, and you did see, actually, you could see here lots on Eagleberry being used pretty heavily. People who normally would have parked on Monterey were parking on Eagleberry instead. But we fully expect that if the weather was nicer, that there would have been probably more vehicles parked there than what we witnessed. Looking at other parts of the downtown, pieces that are kind of critical to what we look at. One is the transit center, down at the southern end of the downtown, that serves both the VTA and Caltrain, essentially bus and rail service. And this is significant because the lots that they have comprise almost 470 spaces. So it's quite a few spaces in the total. But what we found is, and this is not atypical because transit usage around the Bay Area really took a hit during the pandemic, is that even at peak hour, just over a quarter of the spaces were occupied. So most of the lots were pretty empty. So we actually thought, gosh, is this really normal? And we went back and looked at VTA had data and studies they had done pre-pandemic. And we looked at parking occupancies during those periods, and we found that pre-pandemic, when the economy was bustling, that we had about 63% occupancy. So again, the lots, even during, it sounds like, busy times, were not full, but more occupied. The BTA data also showed that based on a comparison to parking demand to ridership, that almost a quarter of the vehicles parked there were likely by non-transit users. BTA, I don't believe, enforces parking in this lot very rigorously, and it sounds like people are potentially taking advantage of that. Lastly, what we looked at in the downtown was what we call parking duration. So we actually counted for on-street spaces only how long vehicles were parked in particular spaces. And you think, gosh, why would you do this? Well, it's very useful because it gives us a view into the types of users that are parking in various parts of the downtown. So for example, users that park for longer periods of time tend to be more likely than not employees or residents. People who are cycling in and out of spaces relatively quickly tend to be more patrons or typical patrons. And this chart here shows for the downtown the kind of the spread of everyone over Thursday, Saturday in the event. What we found is that in the core downtown in particular, where you actually have time limited parking, there was actually relatively good, what I call, compliance with the time limits. So roughly 80% of motorists stayed 2 hours or less. Another 10% stayed between 2 and 3 hours. So perhaps someone stayed 15 minutes late, they had to run back to their car, but it wasn't egregious. And then another 10% of vehicles stayed anywhere between 3 and 12 hours. And I know that's a pretty big window, 3 to 12 hours, but it was a kind of equal spread of people across that, with some folks really staying 3, 4, 5 hours, and some vehicles staying 10, 11, or 12 hours. Across the rest of the downtown, you definitely saw longer lengths of stay on Eagleberry and other parts of Monterey, which is typical. We'd kind of expect that from people parking in longer periods and not time-limited parking. And particularly lots of long stays on 6th Street and near the transit center as well. We heard anecdotally, excuse me, from VTA that they suspect that there are people who park on street in the area and use the rail or bus. So what does this all mean from the existing conditions data? So there's a lot of data out there, and we're trying to do a pretty condensed summary here, but the quick takeaways from this are, one is that if you look at the downtown as a whole, there's a lot of vacant parking. If you look at all of the spaces combined, again, it's a pretty large area. That said, there are what we call kind of hot spots, particularly in the core downtown, where you have high occupancy in certain public off-street lots and on-street spaces near the retail and restaurant activity that people want to access. That said, the private lots, on the other hand, are very underutilized as a whole across the downtown. So, and again, that's not unusual for most downtowns. And you also have a similar pattern occurring at the transit center as well. As I mentioned, the time limit adherence is kind of mixed. Most people adhere to it, but we do have a certain subset of folks who are staying well past the time limits. And that's something that we'll talk about in the strategies. And then lastly, that we were able to get a data set for the event, but as I mentioned, it was probably affected by weather, and we will probably want to account for that in assessing it. And with that, I will toss it back to Abe.
Thank you, Brian. We'd love to get your sense of your experience and thoughts on downtown parking. So in Gilroy, so we're going to have just a little set of 5 questions. First question is, in thinking about the most recent time you parked downtown, how would you grade your experience on a A through F? So just think back to the last time you parked. We got a good distribution. So it looks like a good distribution, kind of all around, no Fs, which is great, 1 below average, and everything else is average to great. So thank you for that. Let's go on to the next poll. Question 2 is, in general, how easy or difficult is it to find parking downtown? Got easy, somewhat easy, neither easy nor difficult, somewhat difficult, and difficult. Okay, and we'll end the poll and share the results. And we have a majority of saying that it's somewhat difficult to find parking downtown. Pretty good distribution, weighted a little bit towards the difficulty side. So thanks for the input there. Next question is, which of these words are you most likely to use to describe downtown parking? And please select up to 3. And let's see what you guys think. Give you another 5 seconds or so, and then we'll share the poll. Okay, so let's share the poll, share the results, and another pretty good distribution. Obviously, these are kind of like positives next to negatives. So a little bit more inconvenient than convenient, safe over unsafe, and limited more so than abundant in terms of the amount of parking available. So 2 more questions. The next question, question 4, if you have safety concerns, so if you are one of those folks who did answer unsafe, or if you just have any safety concerns, regardless of the way you answered, if you could let us know if you're a resident, an employee, a business property owner, or a visitor, and you can select any that apply. Okay, and we'll go ahead and share the results. And we have one downtown employee and a good group of downtown business and property owners, 5, and a lot of you coming into downtown from outside of downtown. So we have one more question. And this one is asking kind of a distance of travel from the place that you typically park downtown, and kind of thinking about your last few times visiting downtown or working downtown. How far are you typically walking from your car to your destination? Okay. So let's go ahead and share the results. And majority of you are walking 1 to 2 blocks from your car. Some of you are parking very close to your final destination, and one of you is 3 or more blocks. So that's actually interesting to know that you don't feel like you have to walk a long way to find parking. So that ends our poll. And then we are going to continue on with the existing conditions with Dina.
Great. Thank you, Abe. Give me a thumbs up. You all can hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay, great. Okay, Brian, are you going to advance the slides? Yes. Okay, great. I'm going to expose this. The majority of retail activity in downtown is taking place in what we're calling the downtown core. As Brian mentioned, this is Monterey Highway between 4th and 7th Street. This area has about 315,000 square feet of commercial space. So about the size of a small regional mall or a community shopping center. There are 85 retail businesses there as of 2021. And about 20% of these businesses were restaurants. Again, this data is based on 2021. At the same time, the downtown core area has about 1,000 parking spaces. So next slide. When we looked at retail sales trends on a block by block basis, what we see is that the 3 blocks in the downtown core have somewhat different sales patterns or trends going from 2016 to 2021. The block with the most number of sales is between 5th and 6th Street. And it's following a downward pattern, again, starting in 2016, big drop off during the pandemic. And it's kind of clawing its way back, although it has not, again, hit the peak that it was at in, say, 2019. This is a very common pattern for a lot of retail business districts around California, where you've seen this kind of long decline. What's interesting is that the block between 4th and 5th Street has remained relatively consistent in its sales and even grown a little bit, so that it's doing better now than it was during the pandemic. And then finally, the block between 6th and 7th is down a little bit between 2016 and 2021, but it hasn't had that steep drop off that the block between 5th and 6th had. We're going to go back and look at this in a little bit more detail. We have to be careful because in order to have the data that we're using to draw these conclusions, we cannot detail to you which businesses are driving these kinds of activities. But we're suspecting that there are a few businesses that it will explain the decline and the precipitous drop between 2019 and 2020. So to the extent that we can disclose that information, we will disclose more about it for you. Next slide, please. One of the key findings that we've had is that restaurants are really driving a lot of the sales in downtown, and they're also driving new investment. The dots that you see on the map represent active building permit activity in downtown. And the red dots are existing businesses that are doing remodels. These are businesses that are open and operating, but just doing some kind of remodel on their facility. The blue dots are businesses that are not operating. They're the space is being remodeled. But in these 4 cases, there are signs up saying coming soon. This is the business. And these are, for the most part, new food and beverage establishments, mostly sort of in the brew pub, wine tasting category. And then finally, 2 buildings downtown are receiving seismic retrofits, which is actually very important reinvestment in these buildings. And we're glad to see that people are doing that now. Next slide, please. So the key economic findings are that retail sales in the downtown core were already declining well before the pandemic, at least on the block that accounts for most of the downtown sales. These declining sales trends are similar to other small and mid-sized California cities. As I said before, what appears to be happening are 2 things. One, these communities are still struggling to recover from the 2008 recession, which seems like it had a very long tail. And then also we've seen a big shift, of course, even leading up to the pandemic, in the growth in new sales coming from online or e-commerce. Brick and mortar sales still accounts for the vast majority of all retail sales in the United States, but a lot of the growth in retail sales is coming from e-commerce. This is partly what is driving this trend to restaurants and what we call experiential retailer. So again, these larger industry trends are probably accounting for more of the downturn in some of these businesses than local parking supply, again, given what we've seen in other places. But what we also know is that downtown appears to be headed in the right direction in terms of the kinds of businesses that are coming in, particularly destination food and beverage, because these will continue to draw more and more visitors to downtown. So with that, I will turn it back over to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. So I will take it back here and I will dive into what we call, my space looks very blue. There we go. Our parking toolkit for parking management strategies. And we call this the parking toolkit because right now we're at the point again of this project. We're really interested in public input. And eventually we will put together this toolkit of strategies that literally acts as a toolkit. So people can, the city or whoever is in charge can draw on them as needed. And we only recommend certain pieces of it. So right now we're in the process of examining the full range of potential options that are out there that have typically proven successful in other downtowns and other cities. But the choice of these strategies obviously will be informed by input that we get, like, for example, that we get from you tonight, and as well as certain goals around them. So, why would we choose these strategies? One of them is to improve the patron experience, right? So we want to make it easier for visitors and patrons to be able to find parking where they want to find it. Managing employee parking, as I mentioned earlier, as is not atypical, you do have some employees who are parking in what we consider prime retail spaces for long periods at a time. And is there better places to have employees park that's also safer for them? As Gina said, we have our economists on the team because we're really interested in boosting business performance as part of this. We want parking to be able to work for the downtown. And lastly, to really choose strategies that are cost effective. Some of these strategies might come at zero cost and some could come at much more. And so we want to make sure that we're choosing the right blend at the end of the day and actually have funding sources for those. So the first set of strategies that are kind of most typical, I would say, in a lot of downtowns is simply just parking regulations, how people manage the parking. So, for example, in downtown Gilroy, on the core, I would say the core downtown, you have time limits in effect. They are generally 2 hours in length, and you do have hours of operation, so from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And every town manages their hours a little separately based on sort of the patterns of parking demand that they see. Currently, also in downtown Gilroy, all parking is free. You don't have to pay for it. It's not priced parking, but that is certainly a management option that some cities exercise to manage parking. It's a great way to manage parking, but it's only really needed when demand is high, and you have to be very careful. I would say that when you implement paid parking. Shared parking. This requires a little bit more explanation, but essentially this focuses on public-private partnerships. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the private lots in the downtown are not well utilized. And again, this is very typical because most private lots are reserved for that business's customers or patrons. What shared parking does is try to create what I call a win-win situation with people who want to participate in the process. And typically what happens is cities will draft agreements with individual businesses or groups of businesses to make parking lots publicly accessible during certain hours. So for example, a bank closes at the end of the day and there's bars and restaurants in the neighborhood. That bank makes its lot publicly accessible in the evening for other users. And generally the city covers liability or costs or things of that sort in return. Wayfinding signage, oftentimes, people find that the hardest thing about parking is just even knowing where to park. And so there's different ways to be able to tackle this. Some are very basic in terms of what we call static signage. So the free public parking sign you see here, which simply just points people in the right direction where they need to go. That's very cheap, very easy. You have real-time availability signage. The sign below is in San Jose. This is generally used for larger lots, garages, things of that sort. But for those sorts of facilities, it can prove useful because people know exactly how many spaces are available before they make the trek over to it. And there's also wayfinding in terms of even pedestrians. So again, these are other signs from San Jose that essentially show how long it takes to walk somewhere, because oftentimes people don't have a good sense if I park in one location, how long will it take me to get somewhere else. And a lot of downtown Gilroy is actually very walkable. And some of these parking facilities are within walking distance for able-bodied people. Looking at the parking supply itself. So as you can see from this lovely image here that was just taken today as a screenshot, is the new lot that's being constructed down on 7th and Ableberry down there. And part of our bucket of strategies is to look at new opportunity sites. Are there areas that would make sense for future parking sites, if that's deemed necessary or good? And in addition to that, are there opportunities to restripe spaces? Some downtowns sometimes will not stripe spaces completely efficiently. This is real. Most of the spaces here are pretty tight, but we always like to put that in there as an option. Parking permits. There are different kinds of permits that can be rolled out and in different ways. One of them is what they call residential parking permits. And this can be handled in a couple different ways. One is that what you see in a lot of cities are neighborhoods that vote, because you always want the residents to actually have a say in it and really support it, to have permits in which they pay some sort of fee for the permit and they can park on that street without time restriction, whereas other people would be time restricted to park on. So employees, for example, who are trying to park in front of a residence, as the case on this sign, could only park during 2 hours during those hours of operation. You typically do this when you have what you call spillover parking. So if there's a large number of, for example, patrons or employees who are parking in front of residential homes, this is typically when residents like to see their permit programs. These also can be instituted in public off-street lots. And so that's something we certainly want to look at, because with the new off-street lot coming online, with the existing lots out there, we want to look at if there's opportunities or if it makes sense. Similarly, employee permits basically designate certain spaces for employees, either 24/7 or only during certain hours when employees generally show up for their shifts. And it helps guarantee that employees can find parking spaces without having to travel, for example, into the neighborhood or somewhere else. As part of this, parking enforcement is always a key component of making sure a system, quote, works. And I will note that parking enforcement, the intent of it is really to increase compliance, right? It's not to be punitive. Because if you're going after a parking enforcement program that's punitive, you may inadvertently drive business away because you're driving patrons away. And so you really want to make it as a light touch as possible. With really, in this sort of case, in a lot of downtowns, the intent to shift long-term parkers to less convenient spaces so that you don't have people parking for 8 hours, for example, in front of a prime retail location on Monterey. I will note, though, that this, like many of the other strategies we discussed here, do require a funding source, depending on the degree in which it's implemented. Recognizing that there are also special events in the downtown. There are valet parking operations that can be used for really high demand events. These are, you can see these typically. I'm sure most people are familiar with an individual restaurant, as one shown here, but valet operations can also be conducted for larger events, and you really can maximize space to fit more cars in, and actually oftentimes make it easier for visitors because they can simply drop off their cars and pick it up later, oftentimes now using an app. Similarly, actually now too, they also have valet bike parking, which is actually frequently used around the Bay Area. So you do have, for special events, farmers markets, things like that. Normally bike coalitions will set these up, and people can bring their bikes and park them safely so that they know that they can stroll around downtown freely during the special event and not have to worry about the safety of their bicycle. And lastly, there's several tools. I'm sure I'm not listing all of them here in terms of zoning, but kind of programmatic or policy changes, ranging from parklets, how we use parklets. Parklets have become a really big thing, and rightfully so during the pandemic. Some cities have started to price them to say that if businesses are going to have a parklet on the street, that's fine, but there should be a price associated with it. You can incentivize certain land uses through lower parking requirements. You can have in lieu fees. So new development in the city in general is required to produce a certain amount of off-street vehicle spaces. In lieu fees gives that new development the option to pay a fee that could go towards things like public parking rather than providing their own parking. Similarly, there have been assessment districts in the past in downtown, and that is a definite, could be a funding source as well. Other zoning changes, unbundled parking pricing. So separating the price, for example, of parking from the leasing cost of a apartment unit tends to draw more people who have fewer cars. Transportation demand management programs. These are a big thing. It's done nationwide now. But particularly in this sort of area, you'd see an example that would be transit subsidies. So for example, if you had a new residential building and those residents were all supplied with Caltrain subsidies or something, or VTA subsidies, and they're that much more likely to use transit. And then lastly, we know that bicycle parking actually was a lot more on-street bicycle parking was rolled out in the past few years, but we're also taking a look at that, making sure that it's available both on-street and off-street. And with that, that concludes the presentation. I think Abe will move on to Q&A.
Yeah, we actually do have a couple questions in the queue. And just a reminder, if you click on the Q&A button, please send a question that way. And you can also send a chat directly to the host. And just a reminder, we'll open it up for full discussion after this, but we just wanted to treat this as kind of a question and answer on general project questions. So Brian or Debbie, you want to take one of those questions?
So I will handle, I guess, I'll tackle the second question first because it came up, but I'll reread it for everyone. It says, I missed part of the beginning, but it seems like the information provided is a snapshot of right now. That is correct. How can we account for full tenancy in all buildings, unknowing what the current vacant buildings will become, but an average max parking needed? And was the total square footage the ground floor of all downtown or all levels combined? And I'm assuming you're referring to the square footage that Dina Belzer cited. So I'll answer my part first, which is, yes, this is absolutely just a snapshot in time. Part of our work now is what we're conducting right now in terms of the parking analysis is looking at what will or what could the parking demand look like in the future as the downtown grows, or you actually have more businesses. In line with whatever the general plan says. So the general plan offers guidance in terms of the build out potential of residential units and commercial space. That said, we also do have data regarding the vacancy rate of the buildings. So we are taking that into account for our current analysis as well, saying, gosh, if 10% of the space is vacant, obviously that impacts parking demand as well. Dina, do you want to handle the ground floor, all levels combined?
It was total commercial space for those 3 blocks that we were looking at. So not just ground floor, but if there's commercial space above, it's not counting residential units above in the space. And I want to add to Brian's comment. We do have a data source that suggests what the overall vacancy rate has been for this commercial space over the last 10 years. And again, it has fluctuated over the last 10 years. I'm not sure exactly how reliable the data is, but it gives us kind of a squint. And as Brian said, it allows us to make some assumptions. If we know what the total inventory is if we assume a normal market vacancy rate of say 5%, then how many occupied square feet will we have? And what's generally the parking demand that would be associated with a mix of uses. And we are likely to see an increase in the number of restaurants, which also has implications for parking, which we'll also be taking into account.
Excellent. So the next question then is, I find the paseos that connect the parking lots on Gourmet Alley side to Monterey extremely beneficial. We've also heard that from others. Is there an option for this on the blocks without it between 4th and 5th? Incentives for the building owners or something else available? Certainly from an incentive standpoint, I mean, we're looking at, there's different ways to manipulate the municipal code, or I should say in this particular case, the downtown specific plan, because that's what governs here, to incentivize that level of access or varying forms of access to and from the parking lots. So we've had the chance, we've toured the downtown, we've seen these paseos down there, that some of them have been really well done. And I know, Debbie, you've had experience, as an urban designer, having worked with a lot of these paseos.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Trying to connect the different parking lots to the downtown is a great solution for getting people to use those parking lots.
Other
If
questions?
that is all
So-
there are no more Q&A, why don't we just go to the general chat and open it up for discussion? If anybody would like to give some ideas or ask more questions, raise your hand and we will just kind of open up for general discussion.
I do see some here in the chat and happy to dive into those. I see Gary Walton had some comments in here. What is your feeling about the effects of AB 2097 exempting minimum parking within a half-mile transit center? Excellent point, and something I'm actually giving a webinar on next week for ITE here in the Bay Area. For those of you who are not familiar with it, AB 2097 was legislation that was recently enacted. It came into effect on January 1st, which essentially eliminated minimum parking requirements within a half-mile of what they call major transit stops, such as a rail station. So the rail station, in this case, being at the southern end of the downtown, the half-mile radius doesn't cover the entire downtown, but it does cover up until I believe between 3rd and 4th streets. So as of currently, there are no minimum parking requirements that can be affected essentially for much of the downtown. And we've certainly talked about this with the city and saying, gosh, this essentially eliminates the possibility to be able to use, for example, in-lieu fees in those areas. So in-lieu fees are still possible in areas where there are minimum parking requirements outside of that zone. Otherwise, in terms of funding sources, that's why we're trying to cast a broad net here and saying, you know, how do people feel about parking assessment districts or other things that are not affected by 2097? This piece of this, you didn't mention anything about education of merchants and their employees about the cost, assuming cost of parking in those valuable on-street parking stalls. Will this be part of your report? Yes, absolutely. Part of our task here is to be able to demonstrate the value of these parking spaces. You know, working in different communities, there are some businesses who absolutely recognize the value of those spaces, and others kind of shrug their shoulders and say, okay. But part of what, as I mentioned here, what we're trying to do, and we're going to be having some specific meetings next week with downtown businesses in particular, to talk about the value of parking for them and the impact potentially, for example, of employees parking in those spaces. Moving on. Does the 3230 spaces include the 7th Street lot? Excellent question also. No, it does not. So that is not included in this mix. I apologize. Once that lot is open, which I heard from Gary that it should happen in about 2 weeks, that number would jump to about 3350 or so. It says, I feel parallel parking downtown would feel safer when seating outside to eat. Hard to back up, and sometimes delivery trucks hog up the traffic flow. With no restrictions on jaywalking, the current parking could be hazardous. So yeah, so in terms of what you're referring to right now is what they call front-end angled parking. You know, it's not uncommon for people to feel a bit of angst in that because you're essentially backing up into traffic. And oftentimes that can be somewhat dicey for pedestrians. It's a trade-off at the end of the day. If you go to parallel parking, it does have some advantages, but you also can't fit as many parking spaces on the same block face, for example. What other places have done, I've actually had it implemented in one of the towns I worked in, is actually back-in angled parking. Some people have opted for that. So instead of going front in, you drive past the space and reverse back into the spot. And so when you leave the spot, when you're pulling out, you can see the traffic. It's proven to be a safer configuration of parking, particularly for bicyclists, but also for motorists as well. But it's kind of had a rough adoption because people are pretty entrenched in doing front-end angled parking. And people are, I think, kind of loath to back their car up. Another one here. I was in Grants Pass, Oregon, and they had a no merchant parking district and a fine for those who park in the district. Penalizing the business owners, not the customer, makes sense to me. Are you aware of a district like this? So they have a no, if I'm sure, let me make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. A no merchant parking district. So I'm not.
That would be where the merchants are not allowed to park, right?
Yeah, is that, yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to understand too. So is the intent of the parking district that merchants themselves can't park, or the employees can't park in the district? I mean, certainly right now we're looking at all options.
Yeah, Brian, I believe that would be the case. You would somehow have to log in the license plates of the merchants and the employees. So it would open that parking up only for folks that would want to come to the downtown as customers.
Right, exactly. And I think what you're probably getting at there is really the employee parking. And again, that comes with its own sets of pros and cons. It's nice in a way because you can certainly, that you're getting employee parking. Merchants can't park in defined areas, yes. So that employees or merchants are not tying up that space. And oftentimes it's the merchants themselves that actually want to have those regulations in place to get employees parking elsewhere. That said, it also requires enforcement. Going back to what I mentioned before, a lot of these rules, I mean, like this, like parking regulations, like paid parking, like, anything, oftentimes require a certain level of enforcement to get it to properly work. And are you proposing to add any additional handicap parking on-street parking? Another great question. So on-street parking right now is something that I mentioned. I talked about the restriping of it, but this is the sort of feedback we'd love to be able to hear, is that if people feel that disabled parking is insufficient right now, we certainly can examine that. There are standards for a appropriate number of disabled spaces to be used for every X amount of on-street spaces. And so we certainly can look at that and see how it meets the needs of the disabled community here.
Brian, there's another question on the Q&A.
Yep.
And it says there was supposed to be a breezeway or paseo between 4th and 5th. Is that expected to happen? I don't know. That might be more of a city question.
Yeah, Gary.
I know that's been discussed on and off and infrequently over the last several years. I don't know if there's any active work going on right now to make that happen, but I know the downtown has other efforts in place or moving forward right now to talk about other improvements in the downtown, and it might come up during those discussions.
Robert, this is I know it was a mix of comments and questions, but I will address at least a couple of them. One is we will take a look at the 4th and Eagleberry that you brought up with the Verizon parking. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look at the parking data to confirm whether or not that's true or what's happening there. And it was interesting to say also hear what you said about the changing retail dynamic of the downtown. This is not, again, I mean, Dana probably knows better than I do, but I would say I don't believe this is atypical of a lot of downtowns. And as she said, switching to more of an experiential type of mix of where people are going to experience things rather than to buy things out of retail. And it's absolutely changing the dynamics of traffic and parking. So for those of us in the profession, it's keeping it interesting. I see Gary has his hand up.
I will let him unmute himself. Gary, you should be able to hit unmute. Gary, can you try to unmute?
He looks unmuted.
Yeah. We cannot hear Gary.
Maybe while we wait for Gary's microphone to start working, there's another chat that Brian might be able to answer.
Yes, let me see here. Sorry, I haven't been paying attention to the chat much. So Gary did mention before, overflow residential parking is a growing problem downtown. Residential parking needs to be addressed. Absolutely. I'm wondering if Gary's, that's what you're calling in about, but you know, it's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of our residential spaces being well utilized. We actually do have counts on those, as well as the on-street parking for residents. I see Candace had said parking south of Old City Hall, 4th Street public parking lot at night. I'm assuming maybe that means for people to be able to.
Yeah, that's the answer to the question. I said,
Yeah.
where do you not feel safe?
Oh, okay.
And that was the answer to the question of where they don't feel safe.
Understood. Got it. We do have a comment saying that I feel there's a great deal of expense in only the core streets, but we need funds spent from 1st to 10th to just address safety concerns. Absolutely. Even though we do have, you know, somewhat of a focus on the core downtown because most of the activity happens there, that's certainly by no means an indication that we're not providing recommendations for the whole downtown. Particularly because we fully realize that in the core itself, there has been some streetscaping done, which kind of naturally slows traffic down. And in the other parts of downtown, it tends to flow a little faster. And we also heard a comment, I think this issue of safety for me is in the east parking lots of downtown off Monterey, all the way to the alley, maybe more lighting there. Absolutely. You know, some of the best ways to ensure, or what I should say, some of the more commonly used ways to ensure safety in parking lots. I know it's going to be in the new parking lot that's being built at 7th and Eagleberry, is lighting, cameras, you know, surveillance, things of that sort. At the end of the day, the best safety that you can have is just simply having more people around. So that's also part of our study, is to get more economic activity and feet on the ground. We have another one that says it's Frontier Communications. They have several work trips there, but mostly work at Morgan Hill and park at the Morgan Hill office. Speaking of one of the employees. Okay. So I assume that's one of the location maybe we were talking about before at 4th and Eagleberry.
If there aren't any other questions, I have a question for the group. We haven't heard much about bike parking. And would you like to see more bike parking in the downtown or different types of bike facilities in the downtown? Maybe no thoughts on that. Any other hands being raised?
Oh, there's Gary.
Yep,
All right, Gary, are
let's
you able?
try. Yeah, let's try again. There he goes. Gary? Still can't hear you. Nope.
Sorry, Gary, we still can't hear you. Maybe you can type it in the chat.
Agree. Well, I can see in the chat people are responding to the bike parking question, though. Debbie's saying that we have a sufficient amount of bike parking. Agreed. Up ahead, farther up, I think someone said, I think the bike options have been handled great thus far, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, we definitely noticed there's actually a good amount of on-street bicycle parking in the area in various forms. So it's always good to kind of figure out if people view that positively or negatively or not. I actually do have a question for the group as well. You know, going through the poll that we did earlier, you know, we asked a few questions kind of in different ways. One of them being, you know, how would you rate your parking experience downtown as a letter grade? And I know that's very general, very subjective, but most people gave it pretty good grades, right? It was A, B, or C. But then when we asked how easy or difficult it is to find parking, the most common answer was somewhat difficult. And so I want to see if anyone would be willing to elaborate on that a little bit, to say, you know, is the experience all in all good, like as in it's safe, but it's just hard to find a parking space where you want it? Or is there something else potentially happening? Or does anyone have any comments on that?
No comments?
Okay,
Oh, there's some chat.
here we go. So Gary was able to include his message here. Okay, sorry, don't know why my audio is not working. Working downtown every day, I think we have a growing problem of property crime, including car break-ins. We need more surveillance and police patrols. Safety needs to be a concern. Yes, well, this is exactly, yeah, and that's why we asked the question. We've heard that from a few folks here about safety concerns, and obviously that's problematic for businesses, but it's also problematic for our purposes in terms of parking. Oftentimes cities will want to or try to institute strategies, for example, locating employee parking in slightly less convenient areas, and there's been pushback, for example, because of safety concerns. People, whether it be personal safety or their cars or otherwise. So that's why we specifically asked that question. Police enforcement, even at parking, it adds a level of security to an area as well.
Brian, I had a question for the group. Have you heard, are you experiencing or have you heard any problems with people who live near downtown having too many downtown patrons parking in their neighborhood? Probably means no.
Yeah, is that up? Candace says, I have not.
Great.
So, okay. And I do see that Victoria added a comment that says, during the day, if you arrive after 10 a.m., you can't find a space in the lots directly behind the chamber in the 4th Street lot or on Eagleberry. And yeah, that's essentially what kind of goes to what I was saying before. Those public off-street lots in particular tend to be some of the most utilized in the downtown, which is interesting because you have a lot of private lots that sit mostly empty, but those are very popular lots. And I can see why they're publicly accessible for everyone. And the same thing on Eagleberry too. Eagleberry, when we looked at the parking duration, you could certainly see that there was a lot of long-term vehicles parked there. And again, we're not interviewing people, so I don't know if those are residents or employees. It could be a combination of both, but it certainly made parking occupancy higher on certain stretches of Eagleberry. We did get a comment that I do not support parklets. We have 14-foot sidewalks that allow for outdoor seating. Okay, this is true. Parklets, the use of parklets is definitely varies from city to city. And actually, I forgot to mention this for the earlier, I think it was Robert, comment on parklets, is that cities have been dealing with them in various different ways. Some cities have kept all of them from the pandemic. Some have done away with most of them. Some are pricing for them, some are not. So that's why there's kind of, the full range of options is on the table here. Victoria says, I know resident parking tends to be an issue by Lewis in front of Heritage Bank. Okay. Also, for a weird reason, Tuesday evenings tend to be more difficult to find parking, even in the public lot across the railroad track near Old City Hall. Okay, interesting. I wonder why on Tuesday evenings. I don't know, city staff, do you have any sense of what, if there are special events or something that happens on Tuesday evenings?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything. There might be some activities at some of the businesses on the east side there that might be generating a need for additional parking, but I'm not specifically familiar with anything that would be causing that demand at this point.
I see we did get a comment here on, I don't know why the comment kind of dropped out of the chat and then came back on. A Paseo along 4th and 5th is critical to the success of this block. So that's good. I think that kind of speaks to the walkability and connectivity, bringing people to and from Monterey via these Paseos, which are rightfully popular. And then Gary, I think, kind of beefed up his earlier message. He said, you also mentioned parklets. The city is supposed to be working on this. And while I was originally in favor of it, I've since changed my mind. It blocks a historic building, and there are not standards that are being enforced. There are alternatives to parklets. there are alternatives to parklets. Parklets, one thing that we encourage people to do is think broadly about the best use of curb space. Historically, people have thought of curb space as being solely for parked cars, and that can obviously still be done. We have plenty of parked vehicles, but we have parklets. Sometimes now they have corrals, in more urban areas, corrals of bike parking spaces. Some areas simply choose to plant more trees in districts where there's not enough tree canopy. So I think one thing we want to look at here too, in terms of the parklets, is, do they stay, are they charged? How do they work? But also design standards. Other cities have grappled with, frankly, having lots of parklets that function very well, but it changed the dynamic of the street in such a way that doesn't feel welcoming anymore. So it can vary significantly. Abe says, okay. Lisa said the lots off behind businesses might be used more because people don't want to deal with backing up on Monterey Road. Oh, okay. Well, so going back to the comment earlier about potentially the concern of, I'm guessing it's a safety concern about getting hit from behind by traffic that's heading down Monterey Road, and saying, gosh, it's a little bit a calmer parking experience parking on one of the off-street lots rather than there. Pardon me. And Gary says downtown is fortunate to have a large residential area around it. I think the plan should address how we can get more people in those neighborhoods to walk or bike downtown rather than driving their cars. Excellent idea. Part that kind of speaks a little bit to what we're talking about in terms of like wayfinding signage. How do we educate people about saying, gosh, when something is a 5-minute walk, perhaps, and you're able-bodied, perhaps you don't need to get in your car and drive there. Oftentimes education really is what's kind of lacking in terms of people understanding their options, and realizing that, I understand most people are not bicyclists, but there's a lot of bike parking downtown. Anyone can bike there too, and the ground is relatively flat to be able to do so. So being able to emphasize that multimodal aspect of transportation in downtown is critical. And then missing one.
Is that it?
Oh, no, we got one more here. So I see in some bigger cities, electric scooters everywhere. Yes. Is this something Gilroy may see, and how are those parking addressed? This is an excellent question. If you have an answer for this, then you would be a millionaire. The scooters, scooter share, and things of that sort. No scooters, please. Oh, okay, that's a good comment too. And again, this speaks to it. It's very mixed how scooters have been received in different communities. And generally you do see them in much more urban areas. So the scooters are great in one sense, in that they add a mobility option to people to be able to easily pick up and drop off in a certain area and get around town quickly. And again, this is more suitable normally to an urban area, because like San Francisco, where you can cover a lot of different ground in a particular neighborhood or district. But there have been problems in terms of parking of these scooters, where people just kind of dump them willy-nilly in front of people's homes or on streets or things like that. And so some cities have kind of scaled that back because of pushback from people who are not happy with the clutter that results from it. So, in this sort of area, I would be surprised if a scooter program would pencil out, similar to what they call a bike share program. They have bike share programs where people can essentially rent bikes and ride them places. But most of the time, the vendors for those services will opt for more dense urban settings than this. And then we see there was another comment elsewhere here about trying to add more vacancy to buildings to really draw more people to downtown. I think absolutely that's what we want to do. And so that's also what while we're looking at requirements for the downtown. And we want to make sure that while we're doing things that are positive for the parking in the downtown, we don't want to be recommending strategies or measures that damage the livelihood of the downtown, which is key. Tom Miller said parklets are key to the success of most downtown cities within the Bay Area, hence why cities are allowing them to stay. 4 people in a parklet have a much more impact on a business than 4 sitting inside. This is also true. There's a lot of support for parklets. We being W-Trans and RRM are actually working together on a different project for a city in the Bay Area right now, where they themselves are grappling with the issue of parklets. And it's fascinating because you have some businesses, particularly restaurants, are very, very much in favor of parklets, and there's a benefit to it. And frankly, I mean, people who are more sociologists have pointed out that there's a societal benefit sometimes to them too, because you actually see people in the street, and it lends a certain amount of safety and vitality to a downtown. And so, you know, there are different sides to the story in terms of the pros and cons of parklets. Absolutely. Abe, 1 second. Let me just answer one more question here. So I did see that another message. It said that I've talked to merchants that there is insufficient public parking other than on-street spaces. Is there any plan on adding some public parking north of 4th Street? Again, that's something we're going to look at in terms of opportunity sites. You know, this downtown is largely built out, as most historic downtowns are, so space is at a premium. So we'd really want to be able to see, is the parking needed in the particular area? Does it give really good bang for the buck in terms of economic return, which is why we have Dina here. And also to collaborate with the city to see, you know, are some of these lots already spoken for? But yes, looking at opportunity sites is certainly something that we're going to be taking a look at. And Abe says we have about 5 minutes left. Oh, wait. You say many of the empty buildings do not have power. This continues to be an impediment to growing downtown. Okay, all right, we do have that too. We do have about 5 minutes left. Other thoughts, comments, things that we didn't cover. I mean, anything that you think is relevant to parking or transportation in downtown, you know, we'd love to hear. And again, I will actually emphasize too, this is not your only opportunity to provide input. So I'm going to skip actually ahead. Let me, in my screen, yeah, my screen is still showing. Okay, do this. So if you have other thoughts past tonight, or you want to be heard, we do have a project website. You can feel free to visit it, and we'll have updates there continuously throughout the process. We do have a hotline in both English and Spanish for people to call into and ask questions or leave feedback. We have an email address as well. So if you do have further feedback, or you've heard from your friends and neighbors, please share that with us. We will also, as mentioned earlier, this is not the end of the public process and public engagement. And we will be coming back and doing, for example, study sessions likely at the Planning Commission and City Council, and meeting with other groups downtown.
And Brian, if I could jump in there, we will put this presentation on the website and have opportunities for others to take the polling exercise. So if you know of anyone who wanted to be here tonight, or you think they should be here tonight, have them jump on the website, check out the presentation, take the polls. And if you know any downtown businesses, that we are going to have a downtown business workshop on, and that's posted on the website on Wednesday, February 22nd at 6 o'clock in the council chambers. And another website that is another workshop that's posted on the website is a workshop that's really focused on listening to the residents in the downtown area. So that is going to be Tuesday, February 28th from 6 to 7:30, and that's going to be held in the Gilroy Veterans Memorial Hall. Also, all that information is on the website. And as we get products complete, we will post those on the website for you to check out. And if we have another workshop or another community meeting, all of that will also be posted on the website. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for participating tonight, for giving up an hour and a half of your evening to give us some feedback. It's where we took careful notes, and we look forward to seeing you again at the next community engagement event.
Debbie, I'm gonna interject for 1 second because we did actually have 2 last questions come in.
Okay, go for it.
I do want to be respectful of people's time to answer these at the same time. So Maria did ask, it's not a parking issue, but oh, there's a red line on my screen. But is the vacancy rate about comparable to other cities our size? Dina, can you weigh in on that?
I don't have data to back that up, but I would say that the vacancy rate is pretty healthy. When I walked the street, I did not see a staggering number of vacant spaces, and there are a lot of business districts in San Francisco that are in much worse shape.
All right.
And
And
that's
then-
not a small town, I understand, but.
And then Stephanie asked a question about how often will these Zoom meetings happen? And so Debbie had just spoke to that. We do have these other meetings scheduled right now with downtown businesses and downtown residents. We will be coming back and having other meetings at the Planning Commission and City Council and possibly one other, but right now those are unscheduled. All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for participating tonight. You know, this is, we heard that this is only, 15 or 16 people, but this has been fantastic and your level of participation has been excellent. We love to get feedback like this. And again, keep it coming. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to your, whoever, and let them know about the project and, keep up on it and we'll look forward to seeing you again.